Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, which is titled Impact of Maternal Mental Health on a Child's Health and Well-being. Tonight's webinar is co-chaired by and co-organized by CHILD, the Center for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development, which is a research center under the Yong School of Medicine, National University of Singapore, which is funded by the Lian Foundation, and SunCare SG, a local charity focused on the well-being of children and youths. I'm Sun Xueling, your host for tonight, and today's webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with you, and you can send it to your friends and family members should you find the content helpful. And please feel free to drop your comments and questions on my Facebook or via Zoom's Q&A chat box. Now, let's welcome Dr. Evelyn Law, Assistant Professor, Department of Pediatrics, NUS Yong School of Medicine, Senior Consultant, Khoo Puat, National University Children's Medical Institute, National University Hospital, and also Principal Investigator of A-STAR. Hi, Dr. Evelyn.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to share in this webinar. I'm so honored to join you on this Friday evening, MOS.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Now, you've been part of this very important research, and I'm sure many of our friends, our parents, mothers who are online here today, they'll be interested to know, why is maternal well-being important, both in the prenatal as well as the postnatal period?
Yeah, so I noticed the title of this series is about, myths versus science. So let me just start by dispelling two myths about maternal well-being. So the first common myth is that having good maternal well-being means you have no physical diseases or you never feel depressed or anxious. And the second myth is that you should be happy all the time as a mother to have good maternal well-being. So these two definitions are certainly myths. So imagine how hard it is to achieve this kind of happiness or to be free of any illnesses at all times. So what does maternal well-being really mean? So well-being is the ability for mothers to balance their physical, mental, and social health, even with life's challenges and stresses. So let me just give you examples of how one can still have a stable maternal well-being with life's different circumstances. So in practical sense, having stable well-being means you can look at life challenges with fair judgment, know your strengths and how you have tackled ups and downs in the past, and how you can still have a positive outlook. And you also, at the same time, know who supports you, and you have learned to be brave to seek help and to problem solve. So all of these can contribute to well-being.
Thank you. Thank you. Indeed, I think if we were aspiring to being free from all forms of stresses and challenges, that might be a very high mark that we set for ourselves. At the same time, I think when parents look at the term development of the child, it might be something that can cause them a little bit of stress. Because what are we talking about here? Are we talking about cognitive development? Are we talking about emotional development? Or maybe take it to an extreme. Are we saying that should I not take care of myself as a new mom, that all this stress that I'm feeling, that it's all going to feed to my baby, and I'm going to damage the IQ of my baby, I'm going to damage my child's development will forever be impeded because I wasn't a good mom when the child was still, in my belly. Could you perhaps share with us what is meant by the development of the child in this context?
Sure, yeah. So I didn't quite answer your first question about, why maternal well-being is important during the prenatal and the postnatal period. So perhaps I can answer that and then go into what type of developmental outcomes are we looking at? So in Singapore, we're actually very fortunate because we have research in this area of maternal well-being. So we use a study called the Growing Up in Singapore Towards Healthy Outcomes, also called GUSTO. Maybe some of you have heard of that before. In this study, we followed pregnant women until they had given birth, and then follow their children until they are now about 14 years old. So they have finished PSLE. And what we have found is that researchers at SICS A-STAR, they found that babies who were born after their mothers experienced maternal distress, like having depressive and anxiety symptoms during pregnancy, actually showed different brain structures and function in brain areas that are important for emotions. And we see this in the brains of newborns using MRI scans, which is a way of looking at brain images with no radiation. And then a separate research published by my team also clearly demonstrates that maternal mental health during pregnancy and after pregnancy are both crucial to a child's development, with mental health during pregnancy being more important because you were right, the unborn child is inside the womb at that point. And so to now answer your question about what type of development, so we looked at 4 different areas. So I'll just briefly talk about it so we have more time for questions. So the first area we looked at is actually behaviors of the toddler at 2 years of age. So whether they have any kind of problem behaviors like being too withdrawn or too active or just too hard to calm down. And then the second area we looked at is school readiness, which is the set of skills, as we all know, a child needs before primary school, like language and literacy, numeracy, like early math skills. And the third area is the IQ of the child. And the last area, which I think is most important, is the executive functions of the child, which is a term that means all the skills that someone needs to get a task done, like having good focus, remembering important information, controlling impulses, and regulating emotions. So, and executive functions are really important for later academic outcomes and mental health of the child. So I know I talked a lot. Maybe I'll just pause right here and just to make sure that I have explained these research studies well.
Thank you, Dr. Evelyn. That is a lot of information. I was busy scribbling it down as you were talking. I just wanted to confirm what you said, right? You said that when we talked about maternal well-being, that both prenatal and postnatal were important, but perhaps your research shows that it is more important during pregnancy. And then you talked about development of the child, and then you talked about certain measurements I think you had made when the child was 2 years old. And then you had talked about school readiness, you have talked about certain behaviors, and then you talked about executive functioning. Could I just understand a little bit more, right? You had mentioned the 2-year-old mark, but what you had mentioned about behaviors, school readiness, does it extend beyond the 2-year mark? In other words, do we see the same issues faced by the child at 4 years old, for instance? I guess what I'm trying to get at here, right, is how much of it is in a way determined already during pregnancy, and how much can mothers, and I'll talk about fathers in a bit, right, intervene effectively after the child is born?
Sure. Yeah, that's it. That's a really good question. So in Gusto, because we followed these children for so long, we could actually look at the trajectory of the development of the children. So for antenatal, so during pregnancy, mental health of mother is associated, so positive mental health is associated with better behavior, better school readiness at age 4, better IQ at 4.5, as well as better executive function at 6, all the way until 9.5. So those are really important things to remember. And if a mother has some mental health difficulties, it goes the other way. But what we've also shown is that there are a lot of different buffers. So, for mothers who, for example, really had a lot of distress during the pregnancy, that actually after the child is delivered, there are many things we could look at, including support from the father, which I think I will talk about more. Um, reading with the child, the amount of interaction at home, all of those we've studied and they do make a difference.
If you don't mind me probing a little further, right? Oftentimes we hear about people talking about resilience of the child, right? So here we are, let's say in the worst case situation, mothers undergoing tremendous challenges during pregnancy and after pregnancy. And I think you have shared about the research and through science that there is a negative impact on children based on behaviors, school readiness. But at the same time, some of us, what we often hear is that if a child has been through hardship, right, that they are able to learn the skills, pick themselves up, and become more resilient, and that's going to be good for them eventually. School of hard knocks and all that. So how do we balance these two perspectives, or actually do they reconcile?
Yeah, I do think the resilience research here is really important. Um, you know, there there are children with different susceptibility to poorer outcomes, which is something really important to remember. So not every child will, let's say, have poor behavior, poor school readiness, poor IQ, as well as executive function. For those who are most at risk, what we have found is that the environment can do much, even having good teachers, being in school early, and building their self-concept early is very important. So knowing these, we can certainly help a child get to a place where they are resilient from the early environment or the early womb exposure. So those are all things that, there are protective factors that come afterwards, even though we know clearly that mental health problems during pregnancy is linked to poorer outcomes.
So I'm going to ask a little bit about fathers right now because fathers have a role as well, right? So, for instance, I would think that fathers, when their wives are pregnant, if they are themselves having positive mindsets, being positively predisposed, having good mental well-being, that hopefully rubs off on the wives. So there is some positive influence there. That's one.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned as well that after the delivery of the child, you had mentioned, for example, reading, about where fathers can get involved in active parenting, that they can make a difference in the development of the child after the child is born. So could you speak a little bit about, I think, how fathers can be involved and how it impacts the child?
Oh, yes. So the father's well-being really heavily influences the mother's well-being. I think all the mothers will agree on that. So if you're a daddy or you're going to be a daddy, it is also very important for you to maintain your well-being and be able to communicate when you feel that your well-being is affected. One thing that we found in research repeatedly is how your partner perceives your involvement with your child can directly affect her well-being. So in a Singapore study called SG Leads, 91% of mother thinks that the father should be equally involved in the life of their child. So to all the daddies out there, if you want to be involved, but let's say work or other things get in the way, it's important to communicate really clearly so that you're not perceived as not caring or not wanting to be involved. So, another thing I wanted to mention about paternal well-being is that poor paternal well-being can be reflected in parenting styles. So, fathers are, we found in Singapore, usually less responsive and less warm to their children, and they may criticize their children more. So these parenting traits are then related to poorer self-esteem of the child, more attention problems, and more executive function impairments. So you can see the importance of fathers in their role also.
Well, that can be a topic on its own for another webinar another day. I think that's another huge
Yes, and we
domain.
have more studies on fathers and their role in studies like called the Dad Scan within A-Star also.
Okay. I'm aware that we actually have like quite a long list of questions that some of our friends who have dialed in, they have actually sent through their questions when they were registering for the webinar, and also some questions that have come through. Let me just bring up one or two questions. Okay, I think we've got quite a few working mothers who are online with us today, and I think they've heard what you said about the importance of maternal well-being. So they would like to know what strategies can be employed to safeguard mental well-being and preserve a sense of sanity for working mothers.
Yeah, so I definitely believe that, it's really tough for working mothers to balance both. Even housewives, I think just having the children there all the time is very difficult. So I think first thing first is that there should be an awareness in society about the fact that women's mental well-being is essential for child development and human potential across generations in Singapore. So there should be a safe place for anyone to discuss their mental health concerns because it is just so prevalent. I'll just give you one example, and if you feel like you're the only one having some emotional distress, in Singapore, we know from the Gusto study that up to 40% of mothers do feel distressed in one way or another during pregnancy. And so, it's really, really common. I do think that workplace employers are encouraged to really foster the wellness of their employees. And, to just think about it, because we both work, I think it's still best for a female employee to be open to discussing issues like mental health, get help, then come back and be more productive than someone else who hides the issue and then don't meet their targets. So, and a second recommendation, I would say that's directly for mothers who are extremely busy or just constantly working, is to focus on what we call heart and soul time with your child, which is a component of many well-studied parenting programs. So heart and soul time with your child can be just 5 to 10 minutes a day. So let your child know that this is the time when he or she can just choose to do anything with mommy. Your only job then is to let your child decide and you follow. If your child says squirm on the ground like a worm, you do it because it's only 5 to 10 minutes. And if your child is old enough to know, tell them you do have very little time, but you want the time to be completely focused on him or her. So doing something your child likes is actually really important. So many times we have our own agenda and we just impose them on our child when we don't have time. But it's actually the simple play and just being silly with your child that are the most affirming for the child. And for older children, I have an almost 14-year-old adolescent. Even watching a show together counts because you're present in that moment. So I talked a lot. I don't know if you want to pause here, but really, I think A third tip I have is really to be honest with yourself. If you need social or financial support, just reach out to community agencies about your need. Maybe it's time to seek help, maybe even from Family Service Center for family coach or befriender, and just let others help you. There are also community programs and parent support groups in your neighborhood. For example, if you're in Pongo, you're lucky because Sun Care provides gatherings for parents as well as positive parenting programs. So I'll just pause here and see if you have additional questions.
You had talked about, that mummies, parents should not be afraid to reach out for help if they feel that they need to talk to someone. Okay, I actually have a question here from someone who has dialed in about what are the warning signs that they should be looking out for themselves. Um, because people can have different thresholds, right? Like for instance, I may feel stressed, but actually, is this just normal? Everyone can say they feel stressed, right? Or is this chronic? Or is this like a stress that I should really be very concerned about? And there's another interesting question, which is about cravings, not directly related to stress, but I think a mom is asking, oh, I have food cravings during pregnancy. Is this a sign of something? Should I be concerned about something? So I guess in summary, the question is, what are the warning signs that a mommy should be looking out for?
Sure. Yes. So this is actually a very important question because a lot of people may have warning signs and don't actually recognize it. So I think the biggest thing is to ask yourself if you feel like you're having trouble going about your usual routine or wondering why you can't do all the typical everything, everyday things. You look around and you may say, wow, it's so easy for others, but hey, how come I'm having so much trouble? I think then it's time to ask yourself a few questions about your daily functions. Granted, I know that there are families with children with developmental issues and, really a lot of additional stress, like a parent who's ill. So, given all that in context, these are the questions you can ask yourself. Do you still enjoy things that you used to? Are you especially irritable? And do you cry almost every day or just very easily? Are you able to fall asleep or do you wake up too early in the morning or you just need extra naps that you didn't? And that's, of course, in the context of if you haven't slept at all, taking care of your babies, that's okay to nap. Or, questions like you just feel lack of energy. And then with the appetite question, it is sometimes that if you have sudden changes in your appetite, like not wanting to eat or eating a lot. But in the question about pregnancy, is that many women have cravings. So it's a myth that craving means, a girl or a boy, or that, the child will have more issues, or that your pregnancy is going well. I think those type of cravings are actually absolutely typical. Um, but what I'm talking about is really sudden changes in your appetite. And also things like, do you just want to be alone and not want to be social? Or if you're feeling anxious and just can't concentrate at all, especially if more than 2 weeks of constant worrying, it is probably best to seek medical help at that point. And we know the earlier you seek treatment, the better the outcome. And one thing for those who are pregnant, most clinics will actually screen for mood issues. And I know women try to avoid it, but it is a really good opportunity to speak up because, as you know, 40% of women, really have voiced out distress. So if you're not sure, just talk to your doctor and say, hey, I'm not sure. There's nothing to be ashamed of in this case. So do make use of that time in your obstetric clinic to talk about that.
As you were speaking, because I'm a mother of two as well, right? And to be honest, when I think back about the time when I was pregnant, it was not a comfortable time. Everything that you said,
Yeah.
right? Whether or not it was swings in appetite, or some of us suffer from terrible bouts of nausea, to just not sleeping well. I mean, it's sometimes hard to sleep well because the baby might be kicking you. You're heavy. You find it hard to turn your body around. So I think we might have pregnant mummies who are here with us tonight. We probably also have mummies who already have had their children before and have delivered healthy children. And we all remember those episodes, right? I guess the question for us is, I think many of us are kind of have it in our consciousness that actually this is all part and parcel of being pregnant. Nobody ever said being pregnant was going to be an easy job. I guess I guess the differential that we're talking about here right now is that we should not be afraid to speak to someone about it, to clarify any questions or doubts that we have, and also to know, very importantly, I think through the research that Child has done, through the Gusto study, that actually what happens to you, the mom, that your maternal well-being actually does impact the development of the child. So you actually want to be in the best form, whether or not it's physical, mental, social, because you want to be in the best state that you can be for the positive development of your child. And I guess you have shared earlier that this development actually encompasses many aspects, from behavior to executive functioning, to their ability to learn and school readiness and so on and so forth. And I think you had mentioned measuring at 2 years, 4 years. I think you said 6 and 9. Or was it 9.5 that I heard? 4?
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Yes.
You have a very good 9.5.
9.5. I heard that. Okay. There are more questions coming in. And interestingly, because I had basically summarized what we discussed earlier, because I understand that some of our Facebook audiences actually dialed in a little bit later because we had some streaming issues. There is a question about whether or not the very fact that there is too much evidence on maternal child health, that this in itself is stressing our modern day parents in raising their kids. It's a very valid question. I mean, we all have Google on our phones. We all have different search engines we can look for, various resources. Maybe some mummies are going to panic mode, looking for all sorts of resources to find out what is the best thing we can do for our children before they're even born. So what's your response to that?
Yeah, I mean, these research studies certainly, every time we discuss these things, there are parents who just start worrying because they think back to their pregnancy and they say, well, I had the blues. I have all sorts of, distress and, even difficult circumstances, like, change in partner. There are many things that could happen. And, I think we have to keep in mind that if you're even thinking about all these things, you are probably doing many things that are already appropriate for your child. Mental health, or during pregnancy is one exposure that we study. Many of these parents mean well and they provide really excellent environment for children later on. For example, even being sensitive to the child after they're born, being warm, taking time for them, doing a lot of that, cognitive stimulation. I think everything really counts. And one thing I want to say is to parents is many times we evaluate ourselves at the end of every single day and compare ourselves with the ideal mother in our minds. And I think that's really unhealthy because everyone has really busy days and there are going to be days that you didn't do all those. But given that, there are so much literature about in Singapore about mothers actually fostering this really positive, stimulating environment for their child. I do think that mothers should really look for opportunities to be really proud of those high quality moments. So not everything comes down to just that one thing about your mental health. And actually, one of my studies did show that although mothers have depression or anxiety, when we look at their sensitivity to their child, their parenting, there's no relationship between that. They can be really sensitive, yet having a difficult time with their emotional well-being. And and it just happens to many people. It could be genetics, it could be, just a series of difficult things that happen when you were young. So just know that the research actually points to the fact that if you are still sensitive to your child after the child is born, there are multiple benefits, including actually all the child development outcomes that we talked about.
Wonderful. That's very encouraging and very assuring. um, I we have gone beyond 9 p.m., but I'm aware that we have quite a long list of questions, and I know that some of our friends had dialed in a bit late. So if our audiences still have questions, feel free to just type it in, whether or not it's on my Facebook or on the Zoom chat box. I've got literally a series of questions that all deal with parenting here. You had mentioned heart and soul. You had mentioned about, I think, a study on fathers. I think whether it was in the Asian context or the Singapore context about fathers perhaps being less responsive. I think that was the term you used. And you also talked about the importance of being warm, so on and so forth. Okay, the series of questions I have here. There are some of our friends online who asked whether or not gentle parenting, whether or not that causes children to be less resilient. There is also another question on punishments for children, that in the past we get caned by parents when we are naughty, quote unquote. I'm reading this out from the question we just typed in. In today's context, parents are more lenient towards their children and moving away from such forms of punishment. How does this affect the development in children and their behavior? So as you can see, I think both these questions have to do with what perhaps our friends call gentle parenting versus strict, or some may even say harsh parenting. And they wonder whether or not these different forms of parenting, what are the effects it can have on children. And I guess the question behind everyone's mind is, which is the better form of parenting? Over to you, Dr. Evelyn.
Yeah, you really gave me a difficult question. So I think, we've been talking quite a bit about parenting amongst researchers, and times have really changed. And I think our cultural values, everything have changed. And with research coming out about corporal punishment, all of these things, there are now some minute differences from previously. One thing I do want to stress is that the more punitive type of parenting, while, we have grown up with that, is that it's very important to look at whether the parent is in control during the situation of, let's say, caning. If it is really used as a form for a discipline for the child to understand they did not, do something that is appropriate and you prompted them that it will happen, this is very different from no prompting, then taking the cane and just really out of control hitting. So one fact to know, and this is from research by Associate Professor Pepe Sito, is that there are 88% of parents in Singapore still cane. So there's a lot of our own culture, our own growing up that extends to currently. But the most important thing about harsh parenting is parents being in control during those situations and really using it as a form of discipline. And therefore, children remember them differently than an out of control parent. So that's one point I wanted to make. And in terms of gentle parenting, what we call permissive parenting, I think at the end of the day, it really also depends on many things. The temperament of the child, right? We all know children are all very different. Some children could take permissive parenting and really just be obedient all the time. So I don't think there is like a right way of doing things. What our research have really shown is that um, the part that is most harmful to children is when the parent is very out of sync with the child. What do I mean? For example, if the child is doing certain thing, the parent maybe micromanages everything, being too invasive, or if the child would like the parent to get involved more, and then the parent is, very distant. I think that out of sync part is important to discuss. So I'm not giving you like a right or wrong way, but knowing your child and being in sync with what they need is probably what I meant by being responsive and sensitive. And so, as you look at your child, some kids just need a lot more of that warmth. Some kids have um, may not need you to be, completely hands-on. So knowing that and just being in sync is probably one thing that I would recommend looking into.
I'm going to just follow on from what you mentioned about sensitivity of
Mm.
the parent or the caregiver, because earlier we had a question about working moms, right? Or
Yes.
working dads for that matter. So there could be situations whereby mummies or daddies cannot care for a young child themselves.
Hmm.
They may leave the child in the care of a grandparent or maybe a domestic worker or maybe an infant care center and so on and so forth. So I guess the first order of the day question is who would be the best caregiver for a working mom's child? That's literally the question that I have in front of me that was sent to me. And apart from who would be the best caregiver, I guess the second question, which is I think the more important one, is whoever that caregiver is, what kind of skills, how should this caregiver be interacting in particular with a young child? You had covered it earlier, actually. You had used the words sensitivity, responsiveness, you had talked about being warm. But is there something further? Because I think as Singaporeans, we're always very focused on skills, right? Like, is there something I have to do? Is there a game I have to play?
Mhm.
Are there certain words I have to use?
Homo, right?
Yeah. So I'm probably going to end after this question because we
Sure.
have gone far beyond 9
Yes.
p.m. But I thought it might be useful, if we end off with some tips for Singaporean parents, and I think many will welcome it. Over to you, Dr. Evelyn.
Sure. I guess yes, I do have something I want to talk about in terms of what would be the best caregiver. I sense that in the audience there are a lot of working mothers. Let me just start by saying that from the SG Lead study, we know that 72% of mothers do work. And that's exactly what is reported. 40% of them say that they have worked more than 44 hours per week, and 90% says that's their regular weekday every day. And 66%, or two-thirds of them, don't have any domestic helper. So you could see that many of us are experiencing the same issue, and they really hardly have time for their children. On weekdays, for any social activities, on average, they have 8 minutes with their child. However, when we look at the number of hours, total hours that they end up being with the child, it's actually 3 hours and 10 minutes versus those who don't work, it's about 5 hours, 30 minutes, right? So there are a lot of routines that the mother comes home and is still doing that you can spend that time. So I wanted to just start by saying that a lot of working mothers have guilt, but It is really reality that many of us experience that we can't do everything. So hence high quality time, few minutes, not the quantity. So in terms of best caregiver for your child, I would just add to it by saying that you want to look for someone who knows how to have serve and return interactions with your child. What do I mean by serve and return? If you play tennis, you'll know that one person serves and the other one returns. So I'll give you an example. When an infant or young child like babbles or even cries, and an adult respond appropriately, even with just with eye contact or gentle words or physical contact, the connections in the brain forms. And these connections are then really important for the child's development, especially in communication and social skills. So you would really want this person to be able to do those interactions with the child. And of course, being able to just establish the daily routines so that the child have eating routines, sleeping routines, and that energy that they have the focus, energy, and commitment in caring for your child. That's all, added plus. So hopefully I added some tips of who that person would be. And a lot of times, I feel like we measure primary caregiver based on time, like the quantity, but I want to make sure that attendees in this webinar actually consider the primary caregiver as the one who's able to provide the best quality of parenting to the child. And so you may notice that no matter how much a child spends time with someone else or grandmothers or helpers, they always know who the mother is or they always know who the father is. So hopefully that gives you some encouragement that even as you work, you are sometimes the best caregiver for your child.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Evelyn. And that brings us to 9:15. I found that very, very insightful. At first, I was a little bit worried because we had started talking about maternal well-being, and I was thinking about my pregnancy, and then, but we also talked about how actually after the child is born, there are so many things we can do with the child. And actually, on that note, I think we should do another webinar on caregiver sensitivity because there are so many years, in fact, we will say minutes, hours, seconds, days, months, years, so much time we can spend with our child. And I think our parents want to know, how do we best make sure that we are spending quality time with the child? And working mothers can do that, even though they may be busy at work. When they come home, it doesn't just have to be like a single time slot that they set aside, but just walking about the home, they can actually engage their child effectively as well. So there's so many things I think parents can do with their child. And this point about caregiver sensitivity, what you have mentioned about serve and return, what kind of games we can play, how do we manage the interactions with our children, I think that's a whole new domain altogether. So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Evelyn, and to the attendees.
July, right?
Yes, I think we are going to aim for July. Yes, and this is a collaboration between CHILD, which stands for the Center for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development, as well as a local charity, Sun Care, whose mission statement is to support the well-being of children and youth. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And I think we have a feedback form. Let me just make sure. Yes, there is a post-event survey form. The chat room is now open, and we'd like to invite you to leave your comments in the chat room. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.